Good morning. I'm Casey Senni, Assistant Vice President for Human Resources and Affirmative Action Officer for Springfield Technical Community College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our Fall 2021 Professional Day. Here are a few details about the day. We will begin with our keynote speaker, Dr. Stella Lopez. Following her remarks, Dr. Shea Butler will moderate a question and answer session, and you can submit your questions to the chat. Since we have a tight schedule, this session will end at exactly 9:50 when you can move into your preferred breakout session. If you have trouble logging into the sessions, email Mary Wiseman at mwiseman@stcc.edu, and there will also be tech support in the Google Hangout all day for anyone having technical difficulties. And now I am delighted to introduce you to our keynote speaker, Dr. Stella Lopez. She recently retired from the Connecticut State Colleges and Universities system, where she served as the interim provost and senior vice president for academic and student affairs. Before the community colleges and state universities were combined, she served as the vice chancellor of academic affairs for the Connecticut State Universities. And prior to her work in Connecticut, Dr. Lopez was the provost and vice president for academic affairs at Northeastern Illinois University. She was also vice president for academic affairs and planning at the Inter-American University at Puerto Rico. Dr. Lopez earned her bachelor's degree in Spanish literature at Queens College and then attended Columbia University, earning both a master's and PhD in Spanish literature. She is the recipient of many honors and awards. Some of them include the Distinguished Leadership in Higher Education Award by the Hispanic Caucus of the American Association of Higher Education, Connecticut Women's Education and Legal Fund Award, Latina Citizen of the Year Award by the Latino and Puerto Rican Affairs Commission, the Connecticut Hispanic Bar Association Achievement Award, and a Wonder Woman Award by the Malta House of Care. Her public service includes serving on the boards of the Connecticut Health and Financial Authority, Open Communities Alliance, the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, and is currently the vice chair of the Connecticut State Board of Education. And Dr. Lopez has asked me to tell you that she started her career teaching at Queensborough Community College in New York. And after she retired, she returned to advocating for the community college mission by joining the president at Naugatuck Valley Community College to work on special projects and grants. In her view, her career has come full circle. Please welcome Dr. Lopez, who speaks from her experience and her heart. Thank you.
Casey, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and for reminding everyone attending this session today that my heart is really at the community college. And that's why this opportunity to talk to you today is so meaningful. I have to really say that I wish I was there talking in person. And it was such a strong desire that I even had a dream a few days ago that I was in a room with all of you and somehow I was wearing this very bright yellow jacket. I don't know what it means, but maybe somebody in the audience who can interpret dreams can tell me later on what does the yellow jacket stand for. But anyway, I am not wearing that today. I decided to leave it alone, but I am planning to really talk to you for about 20 minutes. More instead of providing you answers, more questioning and hoping that you will ponder some of the things that I will share with you, and then that we can have a dialogue, a meaningful dialogue about the issues that you're facing and that we're all facing in many ways. I have to also start by saying that I'm very impressed by the college statement on the anti-racism and inclusion proposed by the Alliance. It was really a meaningful statement, powerful. It shows your understanding of the issues. It shows your commitment. And the fact that you do want to work together to face and to address the inequities that exist and the structural barriers that exist that need to change and in order for us to make progress in higher education. Although my career has been in higher education, as Casey mentioned, I now serve in a number of boards and in multiple boards, in multiple organizations, we're all dealing with the issue of equity. It's in a way wonderful, and it's also challenging because what you don't want is the word to become meaningless. You don't want the word to sort of become only lip service, that we talk about equity and then nothing happens. So the challenge is to make it into actionable strategies, to really create actions and strategies that lead to change, to profound change, so we can eliminate the differences that exist in our society that need to be transformed. I would share with you some of the things that we're doing, because I think there may be a parallel between what our boards have decided to do and how you may think about equity when you embark in your strategic planning process. At the Connecticut State Board of Education, we created a strategic plan 5 years ago. It's called Ensuring Equity and Excellence for All Connecticut Students. And we didn't have, we had a huge discussion about the meaning of equity and equality, because people didn't understand the difference. And by discussing it, we really clarified the differences and what it meant and what it would lead to if we adopted equity. We also became very clear that in adopted equity meant really adopting strategies or developing strategies that were outcome driven, that would result in measurable accomplishments. So we wanted to make sure that our strategies were strategies that could be measured along the way. One of the first things that we did in embracing equity was really ensure that the agendas of the State Board of Education are connected to the goals of the strategic plan. So again, it shows that in every meeting, there's an action approach to making that strategic plan a reality. So ensuring equity and excellence for all Connecticut students, we identify 3 things that I want to share with you very briefly for you to have the information to sort of help you ponder where you go next. The first one was really increasing the number of teachers that were diverse. And that means working in many multiple areas, and not only in hiring, but also with the School of Education and providing alternative ways for people to become teachers. For example, looking at paraprofessionals, who many paraprofessionals are people of color. They live in the communities, and by giving them scholarships to study, they can become teachers. The second area was really creating a cultural responsive curriculum. And that happened through the legislature. The legislature in Connecticut adopted a new course that is for African, American, and Latino history. And it's now a course that will be offered by every school district in Connecticut. It's not a required course, but it may become one, and has been created with input from many scholars, communities, and so on and so forth. Very powerful. And the first in the nation, the first state in the nation to adopt such a course. But the third area is one that I want to explain a little bit more, which is the school suspensions, because that required looking at data. And to me, data is a key component when you're really adopting an equity agenda. What we were looking at was out of school suspensions, who was being suspended. So we collected the data, and of course it showed that males were being suspended at a higher rate than females. But then when you disaggregate the data, we saw that males of color, both African American and Hispanic, were being suspended at a much higher rate. And the worst part was they're being suspended at a higher proportion than their white counterparts for the same infraction. Just showing that data became a very powerful statement. It really reflected of issues that the schools had to face and address. We did not blame. It wasn't a question of blaming. It was a question of providing resources, of saying this has to change. And then what resources can be given to make that change. And one of the resources was restorative practices workshops. And there's a Yale center that works on restorative practices. So that was offered to many districts for teachers to learn and for students to learn, and also conflict resolution. But I think the expectation that that needed to change, the expectation that there were resources, the expectation that there were some school systems, some school districts that were doing a better job, although they had the same proportion of males and students of color, that other systems, their suspensions were much lower. So schools could learn from one another. That changed the whole dynamics. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It means it's something that is being addressed, and both districts and schools are trying to work at lowering it, because they're seeing suspensions not as a pedagogical tool. Suspensions are not a pedagogical tool. When you suspend a student, you're really telling them, we don't want you in school. We don't want you to learn. We want for you to be outside. Anyway, that's at the State Board of Education. At the Hartford Foundation for Public Giving, which is a very large community foundation down the road from where you are, I also serve on the board, and we became convinced that we needed to address systemic racism. So at the foundation, they created a new fund called Action Fund for Social Justice. We raised dollars in support of this initiative, and recently began awarding grants to several nonprofits that are doing work to eliminate structural racism. Now you may say, well, that's a foundation. They have millions of dollars. How about us? Well, can you as a college give small grants to areas that will try to address equity issues, and therefore you're incentivizing their efforts and supporting them in moving ahead? That's just a suggestion. It's for you to decide, for you to ponder. I really think it's very ironic that community colleges is the sector that suffers the most from the current structures in higher education. I think community colleges are the Cinderella of higher education. They get less funding, they tend to get less support, and in many instances, the measures that are used to see success do not apply to community colleges. And one such measure, as you are very much aware, are graduation rates. Graduation rates were created for 4-year institutions where students went, living dorms, did not have to work, and would graduate in 4 years. And although they have been extended now to 6 years, and for community college, I think it's for 3 years, and also connected to the National Clearinghouse data, there's still a measure that is imperfect for community colleges because it doesn't address the way community college attend college. It doesn't address the non-traditional, first generation, low income, adults, part-time. And what happens is the public get this image that community colleges are not doing the work that they need to do. Even politicians think that the graduation rates are dismal, except they don't see the transfer rate, they don't see the stop-outs, they don't see that they may take 10 years, but the students graduate, and they don't see the results, long-term results of educating a different type of population. That's one area. The other area is Pell Grants. Pell Grants were created again for students that go to 4-year institutions. We know in terms of retention that students who are going part-time are taking less credits. It is the continuation of going to every semester that helps them to succeed and to be retained. In other words, to go to summer school. Yet Pell Grants are not really geared to support summer school going. It's challenging, it's complicated, it's difficult. They were established to support the traditional way of doing college. So I'm raising that because I want you to be aware that I'm very much in agreement that community college suffer from the structures, the traditional structures of higher education. But what I want to ask you is whether you have adopted some of those structures internally, whether as a college, you need to change some of your structures and policies and practices because they don't fit your student population. What I'm asking you is if you're really student ready as a college, if your students, when they come, they feel that they belong. And how do you make them feel that they belong? I know Springfield College is a Hispanic serving institution. How would a Latino student know that? How would a Latina see herself in the college? In addition to Hispanic Heritage Month, how do you reflect the HSI identity? Let me say that I'm convinced that whatever you do for your Latino population will be good for all your students. I have done a lot of work with Excellence in Education, a think tank in Washington, D.C. that promotes Latino student success. And what they have really identified and proven is that institutions that care for the Latino students also care for all their students. They all feel belong. The Chicana scholar Laura Rendon identifies something that she calls validation theory as a key component of ensuring student success for underserved students. And I want to call out the difference between her work, and you may be aware of Vincent Tinto. I know Casey knows Vincent Tinto very well, and his retention theory, because Tinto developed it in the 90s. And he was working with very traditional students when he developed retention theory. He was working with 4-year institutions. He was working with students that were staying at a dorm, while Laura really is looking at underserved students. According to Rendon, and I know this slide is up so you can read it with me, validation theory is an enabling, confirming, and supportive process initiated by in and out of class agents that foster academic and interpersonal development. So it's really an all-encompassing approach, enabling, confirming, and supportive process. You have to remember that students, many of your students do not think they belong. They really are an example of the imposter syndrome. Why am I here? How do I fit in this college? Am I sure that I can stay here? And anything that the college does to make them feel that they do belong, that they're in the right place, will help them succeed. The elements of validation that Rendon mentions are the following: necessity of institutional outreach. So that's a question for you to ask yourself. All interactions should validate students. Validation is a prerequisite for learning. You don't learn unless you really understand or feel that you're included in the learning process, that you're part of the learning process. Validation occurs inside and outside the class. Validation must happen early and consistently. You really lose your students the first weeks of classes. And that's something you need to be aware. So to me, those are critical questions as you embark in this action plan that you need to ponder. How are you doing as a college in addressing those issues? How do you show them that they belong in the college? Rendon called for transformative changes needed to respond to underserved students who do not fit traditional middle class norms. I remember my daughter, when she was looking at colleges, she was looking at their endowment. The only reason she was looking at their endowment is because I work in higher education, so she knew about endowment. Most people never would look at a college in terms of how much money do they have for endowment. She knew endowment equated scholarship funding. Anyway, that's the difference between somebody who has the expertise, the knowledge, to those that do not have that knowledge. But Rendon calls for the following things: hiring diverse faculty and staff, developing an inclusive curriculum, working with equity mindset, acknowledging and leveraging student assets, addressing systemic inequality, redesigning foundational courses, and providing social and support programming. I'm going to talk a little bit about an inclusive curriculum, because I know some courses people really feel that are easy to be inclusive of these issues of equity and ethics and so on. But in some areas, for example, in the STEM areas, they think it's more difficult. And this week, thank God, I was reading about the Dean of Engineering for the University of Michigan, who wrote to the accrediting agency, ABET. And in the letter, he really sort of demanded that ABET make equity at the center of all the accreditation work and the curriculum work that happens in engineering. And he gave examples of why. He said, engineers develop technologies that have incredible impact, and they've been very good for our society. But also, some of the impact has caused damage to certain groups. And the example he gave was auto accidents. He mentions that in auto accidents, women tend to die more, 18% more than men. And it's all due to the fact that in the crash dummies they use, they're modeled after males. So of course, anything that is done to prevent the dying of that dummy, it's more useful for males than for females. I'll tell you another personal one that really gets to me all the time, which is voice recognition. As you know, nowadays we talk and we call any place and there's a voice recognition answering machine. And it says to you, please describe briefly what are you calling about? I know voice recognition doesn't understand my accent. So whatever I say, it's going to be misunderstood. And they will tell me, I did not get that, or I got it wrong, or I don't know what you're saying. And I end up insulting voice recognition all the time because there's no way for me to make myself understood and to try to get to a human being. That's two brief examples of technologies that were designed by people with good intentions, but not necessarily taking into account the different populations. There are many multiple examples. You have the highways in Hartford, and I'm sure the highway in Springfield also, that divided neighborhoods and destroyed neighborhoods because the car was more important than people's life and not understanding how neighbors function and neighborhoods work. Again, multiple examples of the need to have groups that are diverse designing solutions for people. In math, for example, isn't it wonderful, that movie Hidden Figures, the way it highlighted the work of Katherine Johnson as an African-American woman really doing the calculations for re-entry of a NASA astronaut, and her contribution and her work, and how it wasn't really acknowledged until years later, but she was there present and so on and so forth. So there are many ways of really adding cultural aspects and making the students see themselves in the curriculum. My role here is not to give you the answers, not to tell you how to do it. It's really to guide you and sort of say, you need to ponder and come up with ways of addressing those things, because it's critical for students to see themselves in the courses. I can share with you that when I went to high school in New York after arriving from my country, I always felt as an outsider. So I'm talking from my heart when I mention how it feels to be an outsider. I felt I did not belong. I felt I was invisible. It was the hardest time in my life. I really survived only because I knew in my country I was smart. And it didn't make sense that I took a plane and suddenly I wasn't smart anymore. So that resonated inside me and I said, wait a moment, the plane could not have done it. What is going on? And that gave me the courage, the persistence, the pride to say to myself, I can do the work. Whatever is going on, I can do the work. Even if they don't want me, I can do the work. And it also shaped me in profound ways professionally, because what I wanted was to dedicate myself to education, to ensure that other students will not feel the way I felt when going to school, that they would feel included and they would feel heard. I was absent 20 days one semester from high school. My mother, I would write my mother the letters that she needed to excuse me. Nobody ever asked me what was going on. Nobody cared. I understand now as a member of the State Board of Education that that's being a truant. But at that time, nobody reached out to me. Anyway, college was liberating because I had choices. I could be with kindred spirits and take classes that made me feel that I belonged. The major that I chose and the curriculum validated me and my sense of belonging. But like I said, the lessons from high school stayed with me forever and led me to become an educator, so I could prevent others from suffering, from being invisible, from not being included. I think I want to conclude by offering you some suggestions as you embark in your strategic plan. The first one is really not to have too many goals or priorities. If you have 20 goals, you're really not prioritizing. You have to be intentional and you have to be selective. And that's hard work because everybody wants their area, whatever they're doing, to be a priority. But they can be priorities if you bundle them, if you include them, if you really package them under the umbrellas of the values that you're promoting. Identify strategies that are pervasive, have depth, and are sustainable. Whatever work you're doing, and this is hard work, it needs to be sustained. If you want to accomplish change, shallow actions will not accomplish anything except produce busy work. Collect data. Data is very critical. Measure, and then don't wait till the end to adjust your course, because you have to make adjustments along the way. Nothing is perfect from the beginning, and that's fine. That's part of the process. You need also to disaggregate data. What is happening to certain groups of students? What is happening to male students? What is happening to left-handed students? What is going on with your students in the different disciplines, in different areas, and so on and so forth. And when I was at Naugatuck Valley, we did a retention study, and what we found was those students that had never completed FAFSA were the ones that were not continuing. They were the most susceptible group, the ones that had not done FAFSA. There will be naysayers, and go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And many people in your college have been around a long time, and they know that change efforts do not stick. They've been through many strategic plans. We've all been there. So the mantra is, this too shall pass. But talk to them and listen. They may tell you things that should not change, that need to remain the same. Remind everyone often why you're doing this. This is the, why do you care? Why is it necessary to address inequities and ensure students can become the productive citizens our society needs? Look at the census data and show them the future of this country, how it's in the hands of these young people that are coming to your institution. So I think it's important to every once in a while remind people of the reason why. Celebrate small victories, communicate, and connect your goals to the college agenda. Change takes time, persistence, continuity, and patience, but we cannot afford not to do it if we want to live in a better world, if we want our students to create that better world. Years ago, I was part of a change project at the American Council on Education, and one of the participating institutions, as a matter of fact, it was Maricopa Community College, brought a poem that resonated with me. They were using that poem to inspire their work, to guide their work. And since I come from a literature background, I find inspiration in poems. So I want to read it to you and tell you why it's meaningful to me. It's by Adrienne Rich from 21 Love Poems, and it goes like this. The rules break like a thermometer. Quicksilver spills across the shutter systems. We out in a country that has no language, no laws. We're chasing the raven and the rain through gorges unexplored since dawn. Whatever we do together is pure invention. The maps they gave us were out of date by years. When I started working in higher education, when I became an administrator, I always felt that the maps I had been given, the policies, the structures, the rules I was working with did not fit, especially with underserved students. What I realized is that there was an opportunity to create new ones. That is incredible opportunity you have with your alliance to create new maps so students who look like me and like many of you can become productive citizens and reach the land of opportunity. So you can truly become the people's college. Thank you very much. Should I talk in Spanish now?
Yes, you may. Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez, for sharing your expertise, for speaking from your brilliant mind and your professional background, but also from your heart, by sharing your personal stories of being an outsider as a young person in high school. I'm sure that resonated with many in our audiences. It certainly resonated with me. And we are so glad that you chose to be a part of the solution by being an educator that advances diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, as you can see from the chat, people were inspired, and we certainly all give our thanks to you. So now is the time that we all get to ask questions of Dr. Lopez. So please, if you have questions, add them to the chat. I will be looking for them. There were some submitted in advance, and I can get us kicked off by asking some of those as you ponder and think through yours, and then add them to the chat, please. So you talked about equity initiatives, and you talked about the use of data and outcomes. So I was intrigued by your mention of the use of data that showed the racial bias in the discipline system in the Connecticut system, I believe it was.
Yes, the public schools.
Public schools, right, in the public schools. So you saw evidence of systemic bias in higher education. So how might we address those issues at the campus level where we might find systemic bias or structural bias when it comes to higher education? You know, how are equity initiatives put in place that can be used to measure success on campus when we think through and identify systemic or racial bias?
I think it depends. I think you have to start with identifying an area that is not working. You know, let's say, for example, retention. And you're looking at students that are leaving. Why are they leaving? Is it because they really cannot do the work? Is it because they're not welcome? Are they leaving a certain course? Are they leaving because they fall on probation and then nobody connects with them? Are they leaving because, again, they don't have the FAFSA, they don't have the financial aid because they don't know about FAFSA, they don't know about financial aid? That's some work that I've been doing in Connecticut and making sure that every high school student fills out a FAFSA. And now in Louisiana, FAFSA is a requirement. So every Louisiana, you may not have the best educational attainments, but FAFSA is filled because FAFSA is really the way for students to ensure Pell Grants. And we all know financial aid is a critical component of succeeding in college. That's a less of a worry. So I think the answer is not I don't have a one short answer for you. I have to say, you have to really look at what isn't working, what is it? And instead of, what I've learned is, instead of accusing, because we tend to say, oh my God, that's not working because it's biased, really to dig into the data and try to identify what aspects are not working. And then again, instead of admonishing people, to trying to find ways of helping people. I took in high school a class that changed me forever, and I'll tell you why. It was speech for foreign students, okay? You can see that I didn't learn because I kept my accent. And I didn't learn in that class because the teacher probably didn't know. You know, years later, I still remember his name. This is many, many years ago. I remember his name because he was so impactful. He made me feel diminished. And what I realized is that my accent was part of who I was, my identity. So I made the conscious choice back in high school not to lose my accent. That was part of who I was. Why would I lose something that made me unique? And I kept it. But that's a negative outcome in a way, you know. And having an accent is not seen necessarily as an asset in this country. It may be seen as an asset in other countries where people tend to be bilingual. But you know, it was a choice that I made. So I think you have to not understand that people may not have the resources to address, they may not be conscious about what's going on. So that's why collecting data is important, because it's the first reflection that people have. It depends. And one of the challenges of doing an equity agenda, it requires multiple strategies, multiple interventions. There's not one cure. It requires continuous education. I'm still learning. I'm learning about non-binary gender issues, and I'm trying to really become even more aware of gender choices and what it means, because I come from a very traditional society and traditional aspects. So I think we're still learning, and that's what makes it even better that that we continue to learn and to embrace things and strategies that would lead to more equitable society.
Thank you. So in that same vein of equity initiatives and being able to measure them, we had a question come up in the chat about how might we also do this virtually with online learning platforms, such as a virtual classroom?
I don't know. I think, you know, the challenge for the disciplines is to really seek out, and that's why I'm talking about creating new maps. I was looking at Google today, and also that's a very simple example. If you do Google, and I do Google every day because, you know, I find that it's such an incredible research tool. Google changes their Google design and highlight these very obscure scientists and artists that we don't know about. And many of them are people of color. They're really doing a wonderful job of bringing to the world, because it's a platform for the world, people that are contributed but are not known. I find that so interesting and so powerful. And it's a very simple way. That's why I mentioned Katherine Johnson for math. And because again, if you highlight people who the students can see themselves in them, then they will be connecting to the class, they will be connecting to the course, they will be connecting to the learning. They will say, maybe I can become one of them. It's really the mentoring, the modeling of what you can become if you get an education. So to me, that's for the disciplines to decide. Again, there's some disciplines that it's more natural to talk about these issues, but I think every discipline can sort of seek ways of incorporating an equity and inclusivity agenda that helps. And also think of, you know, there's no solution that is perfect. Solutions tend to have pros and cons. Solutions tend to have negative impacts. So you need to be aware of the negative impact that some solutions may have. I'm talking about, again, voice recognition. I know you guys don't have any problem, but I hate voice recognition. I go the insults, and I do them in Spanish because they are more meaningful when I insult them in Spanish. Of course, nobody's listening to, I hope they're not recording the insults, but they're pretty bad because they get to me, and they get to me that they haven't created a system of voice recognition that addresses accent. So that's just a minor thing.
Thank you. There was one comment that maybe an urban studies curriculum might be a good place to implement some of these initiatives that we're talking about to advance DEI and outcomes. And so the other question that's come up is about surveys as tools to measure DEI, where we are as a campus. So this question is about closed questions that show up on surveys about racism. Questions such as, have you ever been discriminated against? That's, or you can replace that with any college for a particular survey tool. And other climate survey questions that seem that they were geared responses to prove that there was no racism or issues of race at the college. So my question, or maybe to expand on that, is what are your thoughts about surveys as tools to measure, and how might surveys be structured or worded in ways that really get at the core of the institution?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on surveys, so I wouldn't know how to, create one that is appropriate for your needs. But I think there are many ways of asking people, and I do believe in asking students and for their opinion. I've been discriminated in multiple ways. The challenge is now, I'm older, I'm wiser, I've been successful. So when somebody comes to me from bias, I laugh at them and said, oh, you don't know who I am. So I'm in a very different situation, and that's what education and again, a rich professional life gives you the power to sort of dismiss those things. But I've been discriminated, and I tell you the story, and I will try to answer the question. And the Harvard Foundation asked me to tape something on social justice for their fund. So I did, and while I was taping, I was talking to the person from their press person, the public relations person, that every time I walk into a room, I look around to see who looks like me. And the reason is I want to know whether I'm the only one, or whether there's a kindred spirit in terms of racial or just similar person with my background. He's a white male, and he was surprised by that. He said, I've never done that. Of course, he's never had to do that. I, on the other hand, I'm on this, an outsider. So I do that all the time. Even in Louisiana, I went the other day to see a documentary and they had a dinner before. So I walk into the room and there were about 80 people and I look around to see who looked like me. Okay. And I was probably the only one, and that's fine. I can deal with that. But I still do that. That tells you as an outsider what it means. It's also somebody mentioned in the chat about the accent. It took me many years to understand that having an accent only meant knowing more, because I know two languages well. It is an asset. Monolingual countries, such as the United States, they treat accents as you don't know English. Well, I do know English and I know Spanish well. And there's all studies that say that if you are bilingual and you switch languages back and forth, you will not get Alzheimer's, or you will get it later on in your life because your brain is doing constantly aerobic exercises by going from one language to the other. So now I tout that and I tell people, you better learn another language, not take pills or do whatever. Learn another language to prevent Alzheimer's. But for many years, I didn't realize that knowing that language meant knowing more. So that's why I tell my students, that's one of the messages that I tell. And every time I say that, students are moved to death because they had not been reinforced that it meant knowing more. On the contrary, they have been treated. Now, surveys, you can do climate surveys, you can do a surveys of student satisfaction, you can do, and you can infer how students feel. You don't have to necessarily do surveys to measure biases per se. You can do other things that feed your strategic plan. I don't like bias surveys necessarily because it's sort of looking for the, how can I say it? You have to do a survey that will lead you to identify solutions, to identify things that can be solved and things that can be remedied and things that will lead to positive actions. That's sort of my approach to life. Again, I don't like to blame. We can blame to death. That doesn't solve anything. The idea is not to blame. The idea is to identify if there's a weakness, how do we strengthen that weakness? How do we eliminate that weakness? How do we move forward? So I think that's my approach. That's how I see it. And that's what I believe in as an administrator and as somebody that has worked in higher education.
I agree. As a former chief diversity officer, I lead the surveys to the experts, and the higher ed diversity survey, the HEAD survey, is a phenomenal tool where you can have national benchmarking. We have a great question here. So I want to get to this. In the last few years, we've made some strides in translation of documents into Spanish, offering first year experience courses aimed at BIPOC students and some of our general education courses offered in the bilingual Spanish format. How do you suggest that faculty and advisors point this out to students without it seeming to pigeonhole or to tokenize them?
I think you have to ask them. I think, what language do you prefer? You know, in my case, and I'm sure in your students' cases, my professional language is English. I've been invited in Puerto Rico to talk about student engagement. And to talk about student engagement, it took a whole paragraph in Spanish to explain engagement because it doesn't mean the same in Spanish. So professional language is English. My emotional language is Spanish. You know, I talk to babies in Spanish, I talk to my husband in Spanish, I talk to my daughter in Spanish, I pray in Spanish, and I curse in Spanish. English doesn't mean the same thing to me when I'm cursing. So there are two sides to it. So students may feel the same way. They may like it. And there's also something about code switching that used to be seen as not knowing Spanish or English. Is not that. It's really you're using the language that fits that moment in that context to express yourself. So it's really, again, going back and forth. It's much more sophisticated and interesting than what we thought it was. So again, I would ask the students, you will give them the option and say, this is what it is. I think most students that have gone to high school will prefer English, but I don't know your student population. Students that are newer in the country because they just came in. I remember just coming in and needing to speak in Spanish to somebody to reaffirm myself because it was the language that I used constantly. But now, again, as a professional, I use English better than I do Spanish.
Thank you. So this person has a question sort of twofold. They were asking about the Connecticut High School FAFSA completion initiative. Was the mandatory?
No, it hasn't been mandatory. I found out working at Naugatuck Valley Community College that Connecticut had the opportunity, had an app that would tell the State Board of Education, that would tell every high school how many students had completed FAFSA. I know my work in research, my work with excellence in education and minority communities, how important financial aid is. So completing FAFSA is really a barrier, especially for families. I remember completing FAFSA for my daughter using the Puerto Rican income tax, calling FAFSA at 8 o'clock at night crying and saying, I have a PhD, I should be able to do this. And it was so complicated because I had to, whatever. So this is for me, and I'm glad I did it because it gave me the experience. So for parents who had not gone to college, this is a very intrusive, difficult thing. So I convinced the State Board of Education to really push forward the completion of FAFSA. And the governor, last year, he adopted it, and it's going to be awarding the school who had the most completion of FAFSA. They're going to give them some sort of award. It was just announced yesterday at the State Board of Education, but they haven't made it mandatory. I think I have mixed feelings. Anytime you make anything mandatory, there are people who oppose it. There are people who say that's too many regulations, so on and so forth. But I think it's an initiative that needs to be promoted by both sides, both the college and the high school. It benefits the college if the students come with FAFSA completion, and it benefits the student because it offers them options of where they want to go and how to do it. Again, many students do not know the finances of higher education. How do you finance? How do you support yourself? And that is a barrier, a major barrier for them completing their college, going to college.
So you talked a little bit about STEM, and I'm going to sort of weave in a few questions here. So then you have a question related to STEM in terms of those who might say, how do I weave DEI into the curriculum within my STEM course? And you may have some that say, I really don't see the connection. And I think you've spoken to that. You sort of made the case for that. So maybe speak to the person who says, how can I really want to do this, but I don't know how in my STEM course. And then more broadly speaking, there was a question about those individuals who may give sort of lip service to DEI, but then don't really walk the talk. And I think that kind of lends to your conversation around outcomes and right. measurements. So right. You can say a little bit about those.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me tell you, I couldn't tell somebody from the STEM discipline how to do it. But here's what I do. I Google. I will Google courses that have included equity approaches in the STEM field and see what they're doing. Never invent the wheel. The wheel has been invented for many years. Again, I was so lucky that I read about this dean of the University of Michigan that is saying to ABET, the accrediting agency, equity needs to be at the center. I'm pointing out, all the technologies that have left groups of population disadvantaged because of their invention, only because it's being created by a group of people with good intentions, but who think the same, are not inclusive of other people's needs, other people's aspects. So I would Google and see what is that they're doing. I would call them. I've called in Naugatuck Valley, the president wanted to create a tutoring center that was one stop. I Googled tutoring centers that were one stop, and I talked to people and I saw how they were, and then we went and visited. So it is a process of learning. That's what I'm saying, creating new maps. You don't create new maps out of nothing. You have to explore, you have to look at the landscape, you have to find out what's going on. And to me, that's the creativity. That's the exciting part. That's the, again, even to prepare what I was going to say, I had to Google Katherine Johnson. I didn't remember her last name. I had to Google the dean of the University of Michigan letter to ABET. I had to Google a number of things that I wanted to bring to you. Laura Rendon, her work. I watched Vincent Tinton, who I know personally, and watch him and say, there's a difference between the two of them, because he started from a very traditional way, and Laura Rendon is really looking at disadvantaged students. So their approaches in a way come together later on because it's about connections, but hers, I think, is really for disadvantaged students, for underserved students, for students like the ones that come to community colleges. So that would be my my way of thinking. That's how I think. I forgot the second part of your question, which was the one that I wanted to answer first. So I don't remember what it said.
The second part was really about how do we walk the talk.
Okay, that's the thing. That's the more difficult thing. You have to identify action strategies. And my sense is don't identify 100, don't identify 50, 5, 7. We like numbers of 7 for whatever reason. There's psychological studies that talk about 7, okay, that people remember 7. And then say to yourself, these are things that we want to strive for. These are things that the community has said are critical. And anything that you're going to do is going to take 3 years, because the things that you're trying to accomplish, equity is not, it's a cultural change, and cultural change takes a minimum of 3 years. You don't, that's why you have to collect data along the way. And that's why you have to say, we're going to improve, we're going to continue to shape and decide how do we do it better. But if it's important, if it's critical, it needs to be upfront. It needs to be embraced by everybody. That's what would be my approach. Somebody just said, what was the first major change or process that you undertook as? When I went to Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago, the students really came to see me and talk to me that the university wasn't student-centered. So that was something that became my goal. The president that I worked for, I was the provost, she did not like strategic planning. So I had to make that an underground goal. It was sort of like guerrilla warfare. Do it underground and do it by really talking to people and beginning to do things. We even look at spaces. If you're student-centered, you have spaces where students can come together. The university had spaces, and this is that were sort of what I call airline seating. If you go to a terminal, the chairs are next to each other, so people don't talk to each other. There's no conversation that is easy to have unless you are seated to somebody next to you, because that's the intent. The intent is the furniture not to have people be on their own separate. So the college had furniture like that. So we changed the furniture, we changed the chairs, we put signs. The first day of class, students were lost because there was no signage. And I had to send facilities people to see nursing homes who have the best signs in anywhere because they're elderly and they need to know everything. So there was no signage. The financial aid office had only one line for anything. They didn't have a drop box. They didn't have somebody helping the students to move on. So all kinds of things that had to be done to really ensure that the students were welcome. The classrooms were dirty, and I remember the head of administration wanted me to write a memo to faculty saying that students could not eat at night because the waste baskets were filled because students who worked during the day would bring food and coffee at night. So it's a very simple solution. Somebody mentioned it to me, buy a bigger waste basket, and put it in every classroom. Instead of my writing a memo and will make everybody angry because the provost is saying, don't allow students to bring food, just buy a bigger waste basket. So that's what we did. So all kinds of things to ensure that the students feel welcome. That's what I'm saying. Are you student-centered? Are you student-ready when your students come in? And that's an internal question that can lead to multiple ways of approaching whatever you do and however you're doing to make the students feel validated in your campus.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. We are at the hour. So I know that there were a few questions that were left outstanding. So what we will do is we will send you those questions. And if you can answer them, we will post them on our blog so that everyone will, in addition to having the video, will see your responses to the questions that we didn't get to.
Okay. Thank you. This is an honor. Thank you for inviting me. And I'm very happy that I have spent this hour with all of you. Thank you and more success.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, for others, we left this time for you to go into your next sessions. So thank you, and thank you all for your attentiveness and your kind and words to Dr. Lopez in the chat. We will share the chat with her so she can see all of the kudos and positive thoughts and that you contributed. So thank you, everyone, and off to your next session, and we shall see you soon.